Welcome to the pod, David and Natasha.
G'day, Jackie.
Hello.
David, in the lead up to the National Cabinet meeting on Wednesday, the government was under a lot of pressure to deliver solutions on the issue of gendered violence. And the PM in particular has been really under the blowtorch this week. Can you just talk us through the background briefly?
I think a key element of the background was the public protest last weekend where the Prime Minister attended in Canberra and was with the protesters who were calling for greater action on violence against women. And then there was the difficulty with the protest organiser, Sarah Williams, in terms of whether the Prime Minister would speak or not. And that's when she took offence. She wept on stage. He, I think, didn't handle it very well. And then there were questions about whether he was really attuned to the issue, whether he was really listening to people on this. He wanted to defend what the government had already done, because it has done some substantial things. It's put $2.3 billion into a 5-year program to try and combat violence against women. However, the whole dynamics of that protest put him on the defensive, and I think it raised expectations that he had to show some real action in the National Cabinet meeting that he had called for Wednesday. And it wasn't just for him to do it, it was also for state and territory leaders to do it. So the expectations were high, and they were rightly high, because most people are calling this a national crisis, and that means you've got to come up with real solutions.
Okay. Natasha, let's move on to what the SNAP National Cabinet meeting actually agreed upon. What sort of announcements did they make afterwards? What are they actually going to do?
So the headline announcements from that meeting came from the Commonwealth in terms of things that the Commonwealth would do. The key one there was a $925 million pledge to fully fund and make permanent this program that already exists in a trial form that gives a $5,000 payment to women who are leaving violent relationships. So the trial for that, which was started under the Coalition Government in 2021, will continue until mid-next year, and then it'll turn over to this new program, which will be in train. So that was the kind of headline announcement, if you will. The second thing that the government did was then point to a bunch of stuff that we know has been underway for a while in the online safety space by linking it to online misogyny, violent porn and things that can kind of help extremist views that are against women flourish.
Yep.
The surprise in that was a $6 million investment in a trial of age verification technology. So that would be the kind of technology, it could come in different forms, but basically to stop kids, or to try to stop kids under 18 from being able to view violent pornography. So that's something that the government had been really had suggested it was reluctant to do as recently as November last year. So it's obviously changed its view on that issue. Albanese also pointed to the fact that they were going to legislate to ban deepfake pornography. There was an expedited review of the Online Safety Act that he referred to, but we've known about that for a year. Doxing laws are coming again. They're not really squarely the issue we're talking about here, but he did kind of package up that set of reforms that are already happening in online safety and link it to the work here. Yep. And then the other thing that he did say they would do, which is extend the Stop It at the Start campaign, which is an awareness campaign focused on changing attitudes of teenage boys, and that's also something that has been repeatedly renewed and started under the Coalition a few years ago as well.
Okay, and just on the money that they put on the table, this is a $5,000 payment to women who are fleeing abusers. It's sort of upfront money to get out of that situation. Have we had any reaction from the DV sector about that program?
Yeah, it was positive, and I think there was a kind of relief and satisfaction from the DV sector, that this issue was a National Cabinet issue. So for them, they've been calling for a lot of investment for a long time, but it's never been elevated to the National Cabinet stage. So I think that was seen as a big win.
Yep.
But at the same time, it's one particular policy catered at one at a group of women at one particular point in this whole journey. At that kind of emergency level, it doesn't get to the stuff that happens before, it doesn't get to the stuff that happens after. And it also, people pointed out, doesn't get to the kind of systemic funding of support services for women, which the sector has also long said is not enough.
Yeah. So, David, on the prevention side or the cultural change sort of side, we keep hearing about the harmful influence of nasty pornography and other misogynistic content online. The government is obviously really fronting up or trying to front up to the tech giants on this stuff. How successful are they going to be? Is it really possible to regulate the internet?
No, well, look, it's not possible to regulate the internet. It's a wild place, and it's beyond many parts of the internet are beyond the reach of any sovereign government, no matter how big that government is. Even the Chinese, the Great Firewall of China, there are ways around it. However, I think the government is finally realising it's got to make a stronger attempt at putting age verification in place so that kids are not just signing up for anything they want to get on the internet. It's really targeted at children, young teens, especially boys who get exposed to content that can then shape their view of women and goes to this whole issue of disrespect for women. So it's really fundamental to the work on violence against women, but I think it also taps into a much broader concern at the moment about whether there is an anxious generation that's growing up with access to all manner of content on smartphones, banning them in schools and so forth. Now, the government could have acted on this last year and didn't. They got advice from the eSafety Commissioner to do age verification in pilot form last March, and they didn't take that up. They've waited until now. So I think the government has been caught out being too slow on that.
It's certainly something a lot of parents feel anxious about, so it's probably a political winner in that sense. David, have we heard much from the opposition on this issue of gendered violence? What has Peter Dutton said, and what ideas do they have, if any, to tackle gendered violence?
Well, there hasn't been a lot from Peter Dutton in response to this that I've seen. There's responses from other parts of the coalition, and I think they've got a couple of points that they, which are fair points from them. The first is that they put in place the $5,000 payment as a trial in October 2021. That was put in place by Anne Ruston as Social Services Minister at the time. So that's, in some ways, their project that's now being put into permanent form. They didn't fund it permanently. Labor's funding it permanently. But there is a kind of a continuity there. It has the advantage of putting in place something that's been tested in a trial. I think the other issue is the age verification. On that issue, there's just no question the coalition was streets ahead of Labor on this idea. As soon as the eSafety Commissioner put it forward and then released the report, it went to government in March, the document got released in August, and the coalition said, please do age verification. And then we had months of kind of mixed messages from the government about whether they saw any merit in doing it. At one point, the government said that technology was immature, which is probably true. Nobody can be sure how the tech is going to work. But clearly the coalition were much more energetic on pressing the case for this change.
So why is that? Why did the government drag their feet, given that it feels like a bit of a no-brainer? Is it too expensive?
There's been no adequate explanation other than the language from Michelle Rowland, the Communications Minister, that there were significant challenges and that the technology was immature. And I think that those are fair points. But my kind of feeling in response to this argument is, well, look, if it's untested, if it's immature, if we don't know whether it can whether it can work, all the more reason to get cracking on a trial as soon as possible to figure that out. And that's the argument that the government does not seem to have ever accepted.
I think the other thing that Deputy Opposition Leader Susan Lee, for example, was pointing out this morning is the major things we saw from Albanese yesterday were these two extensions of programs essentially that came about under the coalition. There's no bigger structural change in train yet, or no kind of reform to the way we do things at a whole of government level. And that's why I think probably watching for where the states and territories go on this next will be interesting, and what level of coordination is aimed for or achieved.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you quickly about that because the policing and bail side of things, which is the immediate on-the-ground stuff right now, of women right now who are living in terror and who are at risk of being killed by their partners or ex-partners. The federal government obviously has a little agency with bail and policing, but was the PM able to get the states to agree to anything on that? What kind of push will we have on those measures?
Yeah, so and I guess this is the challenge with the Federation. You've got states and territories in very different places. Victoria had recent reforms to its bail laws. New South Wales, after the death of Molly Ticehurst, is looking at reviewing its bail laws. It's also unclear at this point whether uniformity is even a goal. The language has been very much around sharing best practice examples, looking to each other for what's working, what's not. But there hasn't yet been a strong language around, and we want everyone to adopt the best practice language, or the best practice measures. Like you're seeing in the sexual assault space, we've got an Australian Law Reform Commission review this year into justice responses to sexual assault, which indicates that there's an appetite to have some uniformity across jurisdictions in that space, but we're not seeing that same conversation yet in the family or domestic violence space.
Which is frustrating because even for things like defamation law, it took a long time, but they eventually got uniformity and, they got the states to agree on that.
So it's much earlier in the piece, I would say, and what we did get from National Cabinet yesterday is that there's going to be a Police and Attorney General's meeting this week that will look at or talk about improving police responses, in particular for high risk and serial offenders. There will also be a conversation led by the Federal Minister for Women, Katie Gallagher, around how to share information about perpetrators across jurisdictions. And then they also committed to, a broad conversation, like we said, around the quote is driving best practice approaches across jurisdictions. So I guess a statement that commits to having these conversations, but no concrete commitment as to the form they take or the outcome they're gunning for.
Yeah. Taz, thanks so much for joining us, and we are going to stay on this issue in future podcasts, so we hope you will come back and talk to us again.
Thank you for having me.
And now we're going to welcome reporter Angus Thompson to get us up to speed on the issue of these released immigration detainees. Welcome to the podcast, Angus.
Thanks for having me on.
Angus, last year the High Court made a decision, as we know, that indefinite detention was illegal, and that resulted in the release of 150 people who were kept in immigration detention despite having served their jail sentences. Why are we hearing about this issue again this week?
We're hearing about this issue again because one of those former detainees, Majid Dukushkan, is alleged to have been involved in quite a violent home invasion that took place in Perth on April 16. Now, the circumstances of this alleged incident are actually quite terrifying and brutal. It occurred against an older couple. 3 men alleged to have been posing as police officers gained entry to the house, tied up the husband, and the wife was allegedly assaulted as well, and they left with $200,000 worth of belongings. This has occurred against the backdrop of the government progressively over a series of months, putting in place a bit of a tough veneer around how they want to deal with the immigration detention fallout from the High Court decision by putting in place strict laws around these people being monitored, and a new preventative detention regime as well. So this incident allegedly occurred against the backdrop of that, which makes the contrast quite severe and has left a lot of people asking how and why.
Angus, we were told also that some of these high-risk former detainees would be wearing monitoring bracelets and put under that regime. Was this guy wearing a monitoring bracelet on his ankle? Do we know?
Yeah, in fact, many of these former detainees would have been placed under that condition. What we do know, according to court records, is when he was brought before court in late February, about February 20, for allegedly breaching curfew conditions, the court record showed that he was wearing an ankle monitor then. So he was required to at that stage. What we have subsequently found out was at the time of the alleged home invasion, he wasn't required to. What I've been able to find out is that that decision was made by an expert panel the government has set up to deal with these kinds of conditions called the Community Protection Board. That decision was made subsequent to some advice given by them in March that he wasn't required to wear an ankle monitor. So he was, at some point, advice was given, the ankle bracelet was taken off, and then he's alleged to have gone and committed this quite brutal attack.
So I think
it's very hard to go on.
Sorry to. So I think that's really crucial. We know of a couple of decisions here where the federal authorities could have made different decisions. What Gus has just explained, the Community Protection Board could have required this individual to keep wearing the ankle bracelet, and they didn't. And there was a hearing earlier this year in February where federal prosecutors could have opposed bail for this individual and didn't. Now, it's only supposition about how that may have changed what occurred on April 16 and what's alleged to have occurred on April 16. But I think there are big questions for the federal government on those decisions that were taken that now look like the wrong decisions.
David, Claire O'Neil, the Home Affairs Minister, has repeated time and time again that public safety is the government's number one priority, but that is very hard to tally with this incident, and particularly the images that we've seen splash across the media of the female victim's or alleged victim's face, very badly bruised, completely brutalised. What has O'Neil had to say for herself, and what kind of pressure is she under?
She's under great pressure, and her argument when confronting questions on this is that she cannot talk about individual cases. And she's also made reference to the fact that in some stages here there were state decisions on bail. This individual was let out on bail. However, I think that gets back to a federal decision, such as Gus talked about then, and a federal decision on whether they could have opposed bail at one point when this individual was before the courts. And what we're relying on here is the news media's account of the hearing in February where the West Australian newspaper had a journalist in court and heard the magistrate say to this individual, "You're on very thin ice." And at that point, the federal prosecutor may have chosen to oppose bail, but didn't make that decision. And the magistrate's words in that court hearing were that the federal prosecutor was being fairly generous there. I think people have a right to ask, should the prosecutors have been so generous?
Opposition leader Peter Dutton is obviously putting a lot of pressure on O'Neil and on the Immigration Minister Andrew Giles over this. He's calling for their resignation. This is very fertile ground for the coalition. Dutton, obviously a former Home Affairs Minister himself. How much traction are they gaining on this issue, and what are they sort of telling the public about the government's handling?
Well, it goes to the heart of the coalition attack that these people shouldn't be out from immigration detention at all, and that's been all the government's fault. In fact, the government had to release people because the High Court made a ruling about indefinite detention. It's really the execution and the management of this situation since then that leaves the government exposed, and that's where the coalition is attacking. It's calling for the sacking of Claire O'Neil as Home Affairs Minister and Andrew Giles as Immigration Minister. I think that there are questions about whether those ministers can actually direct a prosecutor in a court. I think the convention is that ministers cannot tell a prosecutor how to manage a case in a courtroom. No. However, the optics are that the government has not been active enough on protecting the community from individuals like this. And that's a great problem for the government. This week on the East Coast, there's been a lot of attention on violence against women and the response on that issue. But this is a Perth case getting a lot of attention in Western Australia, and that's where Labor is already suffering some problems and has had a lower support base than it had at the last election. So the implications politically are quite severe.
Do you think this is almost a sort of two-track issue in the sense that it's very big on talkback radio? As you say, it's a huge deal in the West for obvious reasons. So, you know, it's something that the Coalition is able to sort of broadcast very heavily to its heartland and to voters that it wants to pick up, and other voters aren't aware of how much traction the issue is gaining?
I think that's right. I think it's got traction with voters that the Coalition wants to appeal to, and I think it's also running alongside other issues such as, you know, there's a debate about the sheer volume of immigration that we've got now, where the Coalition is saying we would have a lower intake. So there are multiple levels to this argument about the immigration system, and it's a pretty strong message from Peter Dutton that they think is working their way. The challenge for Labor is that it's got to show that it's on top of all these challenges, that it can manage the overall intake and that it's got a robust community safety mechanism in place to manage these 150 or so immigration detainees, and that's where it's coming to great grief.
Certainly. Listen, thank you both very much for joining us and talking about that issue, Gus, particularly with your expertise, and keep at it, because there's just so little information, it seems, about this regime and the individual subject to it. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Cheers, Jackie.